Thank you all for being here this evening. I have one question for you, though. Are you sure you want to hear this? This is mostly about Southerners in the South during the Civil War who didn't care much for the Confederacy. Anybody want to leave now? Okay, all right. I usually like to start by saying a little bit about where the title, Bitterly Divided, comes from. It came from a letter that I found in the Georgia archives among the collections of the governor's papers from a fellow by the name of Samuel Knight, who toward about the middle of the war did a tour of southwest Georgia, the 2nd Congressional District. And from that came a letter that he wrote to Brown telling him about how divided the populace was, and in fact how pro-union many of them were becoming. Pro-union may have been a little bit of an exaggeration, but certainly having problems with the Confederacy. And I'll read you just a few excerpts from that letter. If you want to see the original, it's located just a few miles down in Clayton at the Georgia State Archives. He says, and I'm quoting here, there's generally a strong Union feeling existing. It is now manifest the late militia bill, and he's referring to the Conscript Act here, is not approved by the people. Poor people has to pay all the tax and do all the fighting, while the gentlemen and their sons are loafing over the country. Families are left without any hope for the future, and many of them are writing to their husbands, sons, and brothers, telling them to come to them at all hazards. I know that many soldiers' families in this district are almost upon a starvation, entirely without meat, not half enough bread. Miller County was in this area, my home county, and I came across a letter from September 1863 in which a group of soldiers' wives are writing to Jefferson Davis, telling him about how bad conditions are, how they lack food. The people that have food, and they're referring to the planters there, aren't willing to support them as they had promised. But going on with the letter, it says many deserters now in Georgia say that they will die before they go back into service. They say they could not fare any worse under Lincoln than they're faring under Jefferson Davis. It is a certain fact that the Southern people are fast becoming as bitterly divided against each other as the Southern and Northern people ever has been. I have not written this letter to exaggerate these things. I only write such as I know to be true. And by the same token, I haven't written this book to exaggerate these things. I only wrote what I found in the records. Well, Samuel Knight knew very well what he was talking about. The South had been very much divided over the question of secession from the very beginning. Most people think the Civil War began at Fort Sumter. In fact, the shooting war between secession and Union actually began much earlier than that, in the fall of 1860, when states began in the slave South began to campaign for delegates to secession conventions. During those convention votes in December of 1860 and February of 1861, there was a great deal of violence between Southerners themselves, pro-Union and pro-Confederate. I remember there was one regulator union in Florida who would ride around by night assassinating pro-Union men. Same thing in Panola County, Mississippi. So there was a war going on between Union and secession long before the guns started firing at Fort Sumter. Those secession votes are very interesting to look at. There's two votes, really. The popular vote for secession delegates to the convention and anti-secession delegates. And it's not the popular vote that decides the issue. It's the delegates to these various secession conventions throughout the South. If you just look at those popular votes, and of course, generally only white males qualified to vote, and even that was somewhat questionable sometimes because there were poll taxes that kept a lot of poor white males from voting. Nevertheless, if you just look at the popular vote for secession, and if that had been adhered to, there wouldn't have been secession, at least not in 1861. Probably Mississippi, Alabama, South Carolina, and maybe Florida would have seceded, but not Georgia, not Louisiana, Texas, Arkansas, Tennessee, North Carolina, Virginia, Tennessee, Missouri, Maryland, even Delaware, all of them slave states, and all of them voting, in the popular vote at least, against secession. Now, sentiment did alter somewhat after the firing on Fort Sumter, but not as radically as I think most people think. In the summer of 1861, I think the Richmond Examiner got it right when it said, and I'm quoting here from the Richmond Examiner, it said, admitted that the South, quote, was more rife with treason to her own independence and honor than any community that's ever engaged in a struggle with an adversary. And that played itself out pretty clearly in the fall of 1861. About all the willing men who wanted to join the Confederate Army had joined that summer. By the time we get into the fall, even a lot of them are deserting and going back home to help their families. I remember reading a letter from Columbus, Georgia, in which one recruiting officer said, it's just impossible to get to even raise a single company of infantry, much less cavalry or artillery. Same thing in Augusta. In the spring, the winter of 1862, early 1862, I remember reading an article in the Savannah paper, which it listed 199 men who were supposed to show up for militia muster, and not a single one of them showed up. So it's becoming obvious by the late fall, early winter of 1861 and 62 that the Confederacy is going to have a hard time getting more men in the field. A lot have already deserted, going home to help their families, especially during the fall 1861 harvest. The Confederacy's response to that manpower problem is going to have a dramatic impact on attitudes toward the Confederacy. In the spring of 1862, the Confederacy becomes the first really national government in American history to institute a draft. In April of 1862, Confederacy institutes a draft covering all white males ages 18 to 35, with some exceptions. And generally that had to do with wealth. There were classes of occupations that were exempt from the draft. But if you were someone who had some extra money in your pocket, you could literally buy your way out of the draft with $500. Well, $500 might not seem like a lot to us today. Back then, average farm family would see maybe $100, $150 a year. So $500 is a lot of money to those folks. Or if they didn't want to pay $500, they could hire themselves a substitute for $300 or $400, and maybe even less sometimes. Or if they owned 20 or more slaves, they could be automatically exempt from the draft. Now, technically, according to, by law, it was one white male could be exempted for every 20 slaves owned. But of course, non-slave holders viewed this as blatantly class legislation, resented the Confederate government for it, resented the planters for it. Sam Watkins, who's famous for his company H books, and gave us the blues. We wanted 20 slaves. From then on, that it had a detrimental effect on their patriotism. Now, the reason, the justification that planters gave us for essentially exempting themselves from the draft is that we own all the land. We own at least the good land, most of the very productive farmland, and we hold the labor in the form of slaves. So we will be the food producers. Soldiers, go to the field, don't worry about your families. We'll provide food for them. We'll provide food for you in the army. That was what they said to these soldiers, sending them off.